So I'm happy to introduce Nithya Sambasivan. She currently works with Google. She did some interesting work in India, and some of that I think she's going to share today. When she did some internship with Microsoft Research, and then suddenly she's been very active in the HCI4D community. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Nithya.
Thank you, and very happy to join this call and to share with you guys. Um, I'm not. I think it would much rather. It would probably be better if this were a discussion. I probably can't hear you guys very well, so someone would have to repeat the questions. But think of this as an informal presentation. Um, like Aniruddha mentions, we go way back from I think almost at least 10 years ago from the first HCI for development workshops at CHI. And there's been the entire field has evolved so much that there have been a lot of PhD students that have graduated and have gone on to become faculty. Folks like myself have gone on to join industrial research, and this entire space of researching and designing technology for emerging markets has become its own legitimate sort of field, because that's where a lot of the growth is when it comes to technology usage. So I'm happy to share some of the work, and I'll pause regularly for questions. So feel free to ask any questions if you have any questions about what it's like to. I'm also happy to not present and just have a chat if you have questions about, what it's like to do to work in industry on problems around technology for developing countries, or what it's like to work with cross-functional teams in building a product. I can tell you things about how to do research at scale, because a lot of the work that I do, so I work at a team called Next Billion Users within Google, and I've been at Google for the past 6 years. Ever since I graduated, I first joined Google.org to work on energy, civic engagement, and internet access in sub-Saharan Africa. And like Aniruddha mentions, my thesis work was in India, largely through Microsoft Research, and I worked with sex workers, slum communities, and so on. And then I had this opportunity to work, to apply my work at very large scale, at a Google scale, and that I thought was really compelling. And it was based in sub-Saharan Africa, so I moved to Ghana. So yeah, I've been at Google for the past 6 years, working on everything from energy infrastructure to mobile data management to Wi-Fi in train stations in India, including several in Mumbai. And of late, for the past year, I co-founded a group where we do very foundational research, looking at problem spaces that don't typically get addressed. So we look at represented groups. Our project is around gender now, and then we're starting to look at people that are coming online for the first time. So Aniruddha, what would be a good format here?
So maybe you can share some of your experiences in each of these projects for some time, in whichever form you'd like, and then maybe, and if people had questions, they could ask in between, or towards the end we could have a discussion.
Okay, that sounds great. I actually have some slides. Maybe instead of using that for the entire time, I'll show you a glimpse of what it's like to work on a few different projects, and I have a melange of different projects around new technology users. So let me share my screen. So this is the freshest project. We have been working for the past year around gender, and it's an interesting one because Google is a product company, and we sort of advocated for looking at women and non-binary people as as a topic of research, and that's not something that typically happens in a product company. But the receptivity around it has been tremendously positive. And a large reason for that is that, despite the fact that I'm looking particularly at India, despite the fact that women are nearly 50% of the population, not really because of a whole range of issues, only 29% of internet users are women. And that means for all sort of technologies, from Facebook to WhatsApp to Google Search to everything else and Flipkart and so on, women are highly underrepresented because there's simply the baseline is so low. So if 71% of the internet is made up of men in India, then that has significant implications for how safe and welcoming experiences are for women and minorities, how machine learning training data itself models around male preferences rather than a balanced set of preferences. It has things to do around assumptions around identity, accounts, and much more. So, this is like a pictorial representation of it. If women are only 29% and men are 71%, then we tend to lose out the voices of women. So we've done a lot of work around this. I can go on and on for days, but I just want to focus on one particular topic to keep it concrete around privacy. So as you may know, women are less likely to own mobile phones. In South Asia, that is the Indian subcontinent, women are 38% less likely to own a phone. And 29% of Indian women regularly borrow a phone for primary access. And not only that, women are regularly sharing their phones, even when they do have access to phones. So the predominant notion in computer science is one user has one account and could even have multiple devices. But the fact is that a device and an account always have one user. And so the personalization and the recommendations and the metrics all are based around assumptions of there is one person that's going to have access to this device. But then we know that sharing occurs frequently all throughout the world. When it comes to women, though, sharing is very interesting because they're occupying this space where it is seen as a virtue to share. It is seen as a marker of womanhood to share the device. So mother's phone is usually the shared phone in the family. And women are simply expected to hand off their devices or come under scrutiny for their device actions. So we looked at how are women maintaining privacy in these shared device environments, and what are some new design directions that come up here, and especially ones that challenge the predominant models here in the Silicon Valley. So we've done research in 6 different countries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Brazil, and Mexico. But I'm just going to focus on India and partially Pakistan and Bangladesh. So we've done, when we started this project, we made a case for why it's important to look at gender. So we worked with various business teams to understand what's the gender ratio of various technologies that we have. And we did a large literature review. And then we did several months of qualitative research. We did focus groups and semi-structured interviews. And then once we had that data, now we are currently doing a large-scale survey to quantify those findings that came from qualitative data. And we took a lot of care to do this research. Because the entire inquiry around this project was around how are women accessing technology, what are the problems that they face when it comes to usage of technology. We thought it was equally important to include men in our research because men are often the gatekeepers for women's access to technology. They're the problem, but they're also the solution for women's access to technology. So we included brothers, husbands, fathers, partners. And we did research in urban, peri-urban, and rural areas to understand how, when it comes to different infrastructures and economics, device usage changes. So yeah, when it comes to women, often the current design techniques around locks and many other assumptions simply do not work, because they are often in positions where they have to hand off their devices to others. And so heavy-handed measures, or for example, simply refusing to give a phone does not work in that social context where there are expectations around how how they behave in family or with friends. So there are many different privacy strategies that we saw in our research of how they maintain secrecy and individuality when it comes to fluid device sharing. But I'm just going to focus on a few. I think all of you are probably familiar with app logs. What's fascinating is teams here have very little understanding. It was like it just blew our privacy team's mind to know that there is such a thing called app log. And I just want to step back and say that there may be things that seem extremely familiar to you, but to another audience, it may seem completely new and coming from a very different cultural frame. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Some of what you're learning may feel like, of course, I know that, I've grown up with it, but when it comes to the design of technology, you know, when there are designers in many other countries, it could be unknown to them. So app logs are, as you know, they hide applications and folders, but the efficacy is pretty low, because we regularly heard in our interviews that children would find out what the passwords were, or other, in-laws would find out what the PIN was. And so it didn't really serve a purpose beyond just protecting certain applications from a few less tech-savvy people. What we saw was most efficient was this sort of middle ground of privacy strategies, which we're calling aggregate and entity level. So these are more granular techniques. So instead of a lock, these are very specific things that women do to delete their histories or search queries or recommendations, or even media that they receive. Say on WhatsApp, they just long press and delete photos or videos. And that is sort of the space that women seem to really appreciate, because given the expectation that I have to hand off my phone to my in-law, to my husband, and the very presence of an app lock screen can lead to questions like, what are you hiding from me? This is the sort of space that women use to manage their individuality and delete sensitive queries or recommendations that they may get. But of course, this is limited to those who are more technologically savvy. A lot of women in lower middle class, for example, weren't aware of these techniques. And these are highly difficult to discover. Just if you look at a few different search interfaces, the way you delete or dismiss a query is just completely inconsistent. Or to even think that you have to long press to delete a recommendation or a query, that just, for most people, it just happens by accident. Nobody even knows that you can long press on certain action. So what this all means for, looking at it from the lens of technology design, is one user and one account is not really a reality. All the way from setting up the device, a lot of people give their phones to mobile phone shopkeepers to set up their accounts, and they don't even remember their passwords and email addresses, all the way up to when you run into issues, you seek someone else's help. So what does it mean to have a login? when there's more than one person logging in? What does it mean to have terms of service or consent? If I consent and then, if someone else in my family is using the device, then who has agreed to it? It becomes more problematic when kids use the device, right? Because they're minors, and whose consent have we recorded? And then how do we think about metrics? If there's 3 different people using a device, our machine learning is not sophisticated enough to even recognize that there are different user profiles as of today. So these are some very interesting design directions to think about. Some of the more tactical ones are, how do you build consistency across different user interfaces to remove traces and make it more visible to someone who's not so familiar with technology? How do you provide feedback to an algorithm? So suppose there is an interface that's presenting a recommendation to you for, let's say it's YouTube, and it's presenting a video recommendation to you. How do you even know to indicate that you can provide feedback to it? And especially if in the past you have tried to, push it down by watching other videos and so on, but it still comes back and you have very little trust with it. So it's an interesting space to think about algorithmic dialogue, where something that is so invisible to the user can be, you can have an interaction with it and control it, especially if you don't even know what an algorithm is. So yeah, I'll pause there for any questions.
Nithya, I have a question. This is Venkat. I'm a colleague of Aniruddha. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So it was very interesting what you. So I was hoping that you would talk about privacy and then what it means to the women and minorities as you spoke. I can understand that the data, because of this multiple people using the same device with a single login, that it messes up with Google's understanding of who this person is, right? I mean, the design directions that you mentioned are of concern to Google as a company, because you want to have very specific information, very good profile of users and so on. But I don't see how Google is working towards improving privacy for women, for example, or minorities. You can improve. It's a problem. It's an algorithmic problem for you because many people are using the same account, so you don't know who's using the map, for example, or search engine, and so on. So how is Google working towards improving access for these minority group of people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, so I can step back. So I can take several steps back and tell you how this whole initiative is working, right? If you're curious about how do you work on big topics within an organization, which is very unconventional. So we've taken up gender equity as a topic, and certainly we're not. I mean, we're doing large scale research, but a lot of people have been interested in gender for a very long time, and its relationship with technology. So after having done this research, I'm getting more into the process here. So we did all this work. We came up with our findings and themes, and we have been working with various teams at Google to incorporate those findings into their product strategy and roadmap and so on. And they've been extremely receptive so far, including teams that work on machine learning, that work, for example, we're working with the YouTube team. We're working with a team called Trust and Safety that looks at abuse, and that's something that particularly affects women, right? So it's sort of an ongoing conversation to, I mean, we're at the stage where it's like mind-blowing to people to even think that app logs exist, right? So we're just starting to build that awareness, and I think I'm hopeful that soon we'll see some improvements when it comes to better privacy, safety, and abuse controls for women, as a result of this work, but also because of other initiatives, and it's like a groundswell of momentum that needs to happen. I should say that in a couple of months, we're going to launch a report publicly. And, the report will talk about our 1 year of research and particularly design recommendations. The interesting and challenging part about taking up these sort of big topics with underrepresented groups especially in a technology company, is that you don't know what to do about it, right? Like, you can take the problem of gender, it immediately feels to a lot of people like that, a lot of people feel empathy for it, or they may have values that are about gender equity, but then it's too intimidating. It's highly unapproachable, right? It feels like, well, that's something that the World Bank should take care of, or that's something that the government should take care of. How can we approach it? So I think that's been our challenge, and that's something we're trying to address head on by saying, look, there are certain issues which are probably systemic, and you can't fool yourself into thinking that you can solve it. Like, you're not going to solve female infanticide. But what you can solve is better privacy, better content for women, better metrics that reflects the behaviors around, what women are trying to do in their gendered roles and so on. So that's what we're hoping to launch in a couple of months, which is how do you learn about this, like share our learnings about this space, but also how do you actually tackle through design some of these challenges.
Okay, let me just put my question slightly differently. Okay, so there is a very strong business case for Google to do this because it will improve your search and other services. All Google products will improve tremendously in India. For example, I'm sure the Google Map doesn't work as well in India as it works in a Western country where people have individual devices, individual accounts, and so on, right? So there is a very strong business case to be made, and the motivation stems from there. And then you realize that there is this large underrepresented population of women who don't have access, and then these are the problems they face related to privacy and shared devices, etc. Right? So that is one way, and if it ends up being liberating to women and providing empowering women and etc. So be it. It's fantastic. That business motivation leads to a public good. Now, as a design school, we don't have to necessarily look at it from a business point of view. So suppose there's a bunch of students here who want to improve access to women, for example. Are there other points of entry into this problem? Rather than just looking at how do I improve my search algorithm for a demographic like India, for example. So how would a student here in IDC, for example, would approach a problem? Are there other entry points which may not be so attractive to Google, and you might have considered and not pursued that angle, but it would still be worthwhile to consider outside of a company?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very interesting question. I think of design as a very broad field, and I think often it gets mistaken for interface design or even interaction design. But design is actually a very broad sphere of creating interventions, right? That people can interact with. So you can look at it very broadly as outreach and policy, for example, rather than simply making a tweak to a user interface. Or for example, when it comes to access, the issues that women face around access are largely to do with if you apply a systems thinking lens to it. Why are women not online? It's because they don't have as many devices. Why do they not have as many devices? It's because there are fears around, partially there's fears around devices being, opening up this world of modernity and promiscuity and so on. Partially women don't have purchasing power to buy that phone. Even further, it goes to literacy. Women are not as educated as men are, so there's just fewer women in the workforce, and there are cultural attitudes towards women going to work. Only 27% of Indian women are in the workforce. 82% of Indian men are in the workforce, right? So you already have a huge disparity. And how much are we going to change with simple tweaks, right? So if we look at design pretty broadly, then there are opportunities around how do you change cultural mindsets, how do you create behavior change over a sustained period of time, and I think that those are like beautiful advantages that a design school has to run longitudinal interventions and experiments and see how in certain communities you can cause lasting behavior change. That's something that we may not be able to do, for example, right? In a company that wants to keep moving quickly.
Yeah.
Hi ma'am, this is Tamal here.
I
wanted to know, you were talking about abuse against women online. However, statistically, abuse in itself is a huge part of online interaction. So, any particular reason for that? That we are only directing our efforts towards abuse against women?
Interesting. I mean, yes, I agree that there's all kinds of research to show that abuse is something that children face, that teenagers face, that men face, that gay men face, that women face, older people face. So everybody faces some level of trolling or abuse or harassment, right? But in the South Asian context, what we saw in our research is that women, not just in South Asia, actually in all the countries that we did research in, we saw that women are constantly being harassed, particularly on social media channels, right? I'm sure you know about friendship requests and prank calls and messages. Sometimes these are more obscene, right? Like there are people that send adult photos to women without their permission. So there's this ongoing noise, but then oftentimes what happens is there are incidents, actually that takes me to my next example. So there are incidents like this one. There's this 21-year-old who committed suicide because her picture was taken and morphed onto an adult photo, and her parents accused her of having something to do with leaking those photos. And then because of that stigma, she then ultimately committed suicide. Many women in our study brought up this incident, right? So these type of stories travel really virally through news media and through word of mouth. And what is fascinating is in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, we didn't see this in other parts of the world where we did research. Many women don't use their faces as profile pictures. So they use flowers, babies, group photos, like pictures you can't really abuse, right, to damage their reputation. So even if it's not a direct threat that women may have encountered, so of course not all the women in our study have had their photos morphed, but these are proactive measures that a lot of women take because you simply can't argue with the fact there's a lot of research, right, that, I mean, there's like a rape incident every single day. The world is simply just a lot more unsafe for women and minorities than it is for for men. So I agree with you that abuse is something that pretty much everybody faces, but it's just disproportionately higher for women, especially when they are seen as in some context they're seen from a very patriarchal lens, right? Like if a woman has a slightly glamorous photo, then she will just attract way too many friend requests and abuse. Or if a woman is confident and expresses herself online through a strong statement on Twitter, you must have heard of how, for example, Barka Dutt gets trolled all the time, or any kind of woman who's a public figure gets trolled online. So yeah, this is just a problem that affects minorities a lot more, and not just women, but also LGBTQ community. You know, the gay men or lesbian women get threats online that I'm going to out your identity. Transgender people get threatened online, and so on.
So Nithya, I had a couple of questions actually. So one is sort of slightly unrelated to what we are talking about now, and then one is related. So I wanted to ask the unrelated question first, which was so in your study you looked at privacy across so many places. Did you find, or do you think that privacy is deeply connected with culture, and what may be private in one culture may not be private in another culture, or is there some universal notion of privacy?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Something that we found in our interviews was that when we would, these were pretty broad interviews, but when we would talk about privacy, many women would say, "Oh, privacy, I don't do privacy. That's not for me." But all these rich women, that privacy is for them. So there was this perception that privacy is a Western concept. For some, not all. I think as we saw this especially with the lower income women than the upper income ones. That it's almost like the analogy is you have your own room and you close the door, right? When you're expected to, what's virtuous is to be out there with your family and open boundaries and so on. But the interesting part is 5 minutes into that conversation, they would talk about how they have all these techniques to manage they delete their search queries, they delete their search histories and so on. So they may not call it privacy, but definitely there are strategies that all of our participants use. There's probably many different local notions of privacy and what that means. And of course, the consequences of privacy are also pretty different around the world. For example, in Nigeria, we heard a lot of concerns about physical safety and violence, whereas in India, it was a lot of sexual concerns, right, around women and reputation damage. Whereas, in Nigeria, it was, if I put up on Facebook that I'm going on vacation, then somebody might come and rob my house or kidnap me on the way to my vacation spot. I think for us, that's actually an interesting question, because the design recommendations that we would propose to Google are kind of cross-cutting, right? Because they have to apply at a larger scale than just one particular city or one particular town. I think simply making privacy controls more visible and easy to understand will just cut across a lot of different use cases than one demographic.
Okay.
Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's a big issue. I had a second question, which was actually related to what Amal asked earlier, which is, often there are many things which are sort of, you mentioned, for example, phone sharing, but there could be many other issues. So how do you mentioned Barkhadat, for example, and I haven't, of course, been following all the trolls that Barkhadat receives. I know that she gets a lot of them, but I don't know if she gets them because she's a woman or because of her political views. And so how do you, or do you even attempt to tease out gender issues from other social issues? Do you even attempt to, is it, I mean, so that's the, when we say that we are doing some research in gender, inevitably other social aspects will get mixed up with it. And so do you do the balance of saying that this doesn't look like a gender issue to me, Barkhadat case particular, or you say because it's a woman it has to be a gender issue? How do you handle it, basically?
Yeah, so one way that we're handling this is large samples and to have rigorous research that we can then use to compare. So we're doing comparative analysis across these different countries, where we have pretty much the same set of questions, but then they're adapted for the specific cultural context. So I definitely think that there is intersectionality, right, for women, in the sense that a lower caste woman is likely to face different set of issues than say a Muslim woman versus say someone that has a certain sexual orientation. that's not heterosexual. So these sort of factors intersect with being a woman and affect different women differently. But then because we have a fairly large sample, we're able to see what cuts across all of these factors. So Barka that I was citing is an example for, of course you can't take away the fact that she's a public figure, but you really don't hear as many trolling cases that public, men face. And they probably do, folks like Rajdeep Sardesai and whatnot. So, so leaving that aside, I think on a less of a public figure and more of people that surround you, women regularly face mild to somewhat moderate forms of harassment. Sometimes this, like in Bangladesh, we heard actually of a story of how one guy's sister's face was morphed. We heard another story of how a fake profile was created of a girl in school, and she was adding the fake profile was adding other guys from the school, and she didn't even know about it, and then people were reacting very differently to her in school. So it can go from I want to make friendship with you kind of requests to somewhat moderate, and then in a few cases very extreme.
Okay. Maybe we can see some other stuff that you wanted to talk about.
I'm happy to move on from this topic to maybe crisis response. So we did some research 2 years ago on floods in Chennai in South India, and this was in November, December of 2015. Our research was a couple of months after that, but we were involved in during the floods as well as volunteers. So a question was, what is the ground level crisis response in a global South city, right? In a developing country's in a capital city of a state in India, and how do the social and economic aspects of citizens intersect with the crisis response. So in 2015, there were 2 big spells of rains that happened in Chennai, and it was the highest water level in 100 years. And a lot of this had to do with just poor urban planning and building over lakes and water bodies and filling it up with landfill and concrete. And so when it rained for a sustained period of time, Chennai is a coastal city, and so water simply went through the entire city into the sea. So it didn't just affect Chennai. This is the South Indian floods that happened. It affected parts of AP and Pondicherry and other parts of Tamil Nadu and so on. So what happened was, when it had been raining for a couple of days, and then overnight, at I think post midnight, there was a huge reservoir that provides drinking water to the city that got filled up, and so the gates were opened up with pretty much very little warning to the citizens of the city. And so, like I mentioned, it's a coastal city, so the water it just went through the entire city. And water doesn't differentiate, right? Whether you're rich or poor, it brought sewage and waste materials with it, and it went through most of the houses of the city. And over 500 people died as a result of the floods as a whole. And of course, there were, trees and animals that were destroyed. And so for a week, basic needs like water supply, food, fuel were all cut off for the city. And so this is almost a calamity for the city of Chennai. Hospitals, mortuaries, airports were all shut down for 3 to 4 days. There were even incidents of water entering hospitals and not having electricity, and so some people died as a result of lack of oxygen. And interestingly, this is the political part of it. The North versus South divide. It didn't get media coverage for 2 weeks. And it was only the local news channels that were covering it initially. And in fact, I was here in San Francisco and I was just watching regional news. And I'm from Chennai, by the way. And my parents were there. So it took quite a bit of momentum for Delhi to come down to Chennai and cover the incidents. So what happened is because water went up to the ceiling level of many different houses, and so the lower income houses were a lot more devastated by the floods because they pretty much lost all of their material possessions that they've accumulated over the years and saved up for. So we conducted research on the ground a couple of months after the floods. During the floods, I was volunteering online and passing requests back to Google. And so, for example, we made Hangouts calls free. We, coordinated a bunch of volunteer groups using Googlers in Bangalore and so on. So we conducted research with families and businesses and with volunteer groups. So I'll get more into the volunteer groups, including fishermen. We also did online tweet analysis. So we collected the tweets. So what happened was at the onset of the floods, Twitter India proposed two hashtags, Chennai Rains and Chennai Rains Help, as sort of the official tags. And so we curated those tweets and then we analyzed them, looked for patterns. And our research was done in a mix of different demographics. But particularly we followed the water bodies, the lakes and the rivers, because those areas were a lot more affected because of water flow. So this was during the time of Jayalalitha. There was really terrible government response when the floods happened. So when the water was released from the reservoir, it was announced on Twitter, but as we saw, there was no electricity for most of the city. 60% of the city did not have electricity. And of course, poor, low-income communities are not checking Twitter, especially at midnight. So it just caught a lot of people by surprise. And they woke up and they found that their houses were flooded, or many didn't even go to sleep, of course. And the governmental response was extremely inadequate for the problem at hand. There was political branding that was going on. So even when aid was deployed by the government, as you can see in this photo, they appropriated it by putting up stickers of the chief minister and making it seem political rather than welfare. There was really weak central government response as well. And in turn, what was most fascinating about this, of course, it's a tragic event, but what is really interesting about this incident is that it was the citizens and the public figures of Chennai that led an extremely efficient crisis response. And that's something that's a little bit counter to, say, what you see in like the New York Hurricane Sandy, right? Like you have institutional structures in many parts of the world that respond to disasters and deploy services immediately. They have their own problems, but there are relatively functional structures in many parts of the world. Whereas here, what we saw was that there was almost, from the communities that we interviewed, government didn't even come in to the picture. It was citizens that helped them out. So we saw an emergent citizen response. There was immediate mobilization of civil society groups. So, for example, colleagues would form a group, college friends would form a group, neighbors would form a group, and so on. So wherever there was social capital, there was the emergence of a group. And we saw this particularly with middle class and upper middle class demographics that formed these groups and helped out. It was a lot of snowballing. So I know someone, and then they know someone else, and then we form a group. And the biggest activity that we saw from our research was verifying and sourcing relief. So because these are citizen groups, the most crucial part that they played was in understanding who needs help, and then how do we get them help, and then who can provide help, and then how do we send them to the right place and with the right materials. They used a lot of lowest common denominator tools because these were groups of, groups that just came together overnight. And so they would use whatever was available without, if you go to the Play Store, if you go online, there are a lot of crisis response tools, right? Or there are like open data kit type of forms that you can create for survey collection during crises and so on. But then really people just used whatever they had, which is WhatsApp and a little bit of Facebook. Of course, citizens cannot fulfill all the needs in a crisis. For example, they can't airlift people from buildings, or they can't rescue people using fire trucks and so on. So what was interesting was, in the absence of governmental response, that space was filled up by celebrities in the city. So this is, of course, as you may know, it's a city that loves its actors and actresses, and when the floods happened, many of these actors and actresses would play the role of almost government, so like quasi-government, because they had very large fan bases. They would play the role of collecting information, filtering it, and then sharing it back to their fans and their followers, who would then retweet and so on. So we looked at the tweets, and out of the 50 most influential accounts, that is the 50 accounts that were retweeted the most, 26 were celebrities. So this includes cricket stars, actors, just social public figures. So that was very interesting to see. But of course, celebrities are not crisis response experts, right? So they don't know what to do. They're relying very much on the inputs of the people that they're following. It was also interesting to see that it was sort of a moment when fans could interact with celebrities in close proximity, and they would actually respond to some requests, and so unlike other situations. For the online social media content around crisis updates, so for example around aid or public health alerts, there's a lot of fake news, and research shows that when there is a crisis, there's fake news. You saw messages like this crocodile. Chennai has a crocodile park in the outskirts of the city. There were messages floating around that crocodiles have escaped into the water, that you'll get diseases, there are snakes in the water, and it was freaking people out because water was up to the ceiling and they didn't really know what was true and what was false. And the interesting part is, typically the government is the one that verifies. So here in the US, after Hurricane Katrina, there's a disaster response body called FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, and they've started a rumor control website. So because during crises you get a lot of fake information, they just verify the information and post it online. So in the Chennai case, it was the film stars that were verifying the information and posting it back. So as you can see in some of these tweets, they would use a verified hashtag by using their fan bases. And the freshness declined very quickly. So because a lot of the messages were passed through social media and content was moving from one network to another, it became stale very quickly. So there were a few deaths that happened as a result of just delayed propagation, or because people hadn't bothered to call and verify whether they still needed the aid and so on. So we heard about a couple of babies dying because help just got to that place too late. Another interesting aspect is that when so some of the most active citizen groups were offline, but there were also some remarkable citizen groups that were online. So there was a Google spreadsheet that was created. It was a huge effort of people round the clock working to clean it up and to coordinate and just ensure that it was used well. But inadvertently, when we interviewed the citizen volunteers, they talked about how they managed to, ignore the lower income groups and the lower caste groups. So when we analyze the tweets, the purple circles represent the volume of the tweets from different neighborhoods, and you can see the blue body on the left-hand side, so that's the reservoir. So there's almost no representation from those areas, and from the parts of Chennai, the north of Chennai, which is traditionally lower caste, and the neighborhoods that we conducted interviews in also had less representation from, for example, the slum communities and so on. So inadvertently, big data here was leveraged towards helping the middle class and the those that are not, fragile when it comes to welfare and aid and so on. So for those communities, it was those offline networks that helped the most. Crisis response in sort of a low resource city looks fairly different from a crisis response in a high resource city. Information is key everywhere. Fake information flourishes everywhere. Government is somewhat ineffective everywhere. But how you deal with it, the structures are very different. For example, here, a lot of the crisis response research in HCI tends to just look at Twitter for sourcing the data. But when it comes to research methods, in a case like Chennai, you can't simply look at Twitter because most people aren't on Twitter. And it's, especially in a crisis, most of the cell towers die. And so it's really important to look at online and offline methods for conducting research to see what are the gaps between the two and who's represented online and who's represented offline. Altruism is very high. People want to help in any sort of a crisis situation. This is just true worldwide. But that's an interesting angle to think about. How do you use that, at the spur of the moment in providing help more broadly, if people want to. The infrastructure problem is also definitely something to take into account for the role of technology. Tools here probably need to work offline, and but that presents challenges for how do you in a disaster you want to coordinate and you want to communicate with different people to know what's going on and get the latest information. That's challenging when cell towers are out. Yeah, I'll stop there. That's a glimpse of some of the work that we did here. Any questions?
Hi Nithya, I wanted to ask you what do you think is different working in the HCI4D domain in a big product company like Google versus, let's say, any other research lab? Another question that I had is, how do you measure very qualitative metrics such as, let's say, privacy for people?
HCI4D in a company like Google. Let's be honest. I think large, especially corporations, are businesses at the end of the day, right? Same for startups and whatnot. So businesses are businesses, and while a lot of businesses today are very interested in designing for people in, say, India or Philippines or Kenya, because that's where all the new technology growth is, it's important to sort of differentiate that from social impact and not fool yourself that it is that. But another argument to think about is that if you design something that's meaningful or useful to somebody, then that is making a certain level of difference in their life. So HCI4D in a place like Google, I'll just answer that as research in India or in other emerging markets. What does it involve? It involves some very interesting challenges, some methodological challenges. How do you, for different topics, say there's a team that wants to build a product like Google Glass for, I don't know, at a very low cost. How do you identify the right research questions, right? And how do you design the right research methods? How does design work with research? And the interesting part is you're doing this collaboratively. It's not like an individual project. I can't just go away as a researcher and and I can do my own thing, but then people are not going to listen to me if I'm not answering their questions, right? So it's important to do this The product team at Google has research, design, product management, engineers. There are folks like marketing, policy, and so on. So you have to learn to work with different disciplines. And in fact, I think that improves design because you get better ideas and better questions as a result. What else? You have to think about time zone coordination because teams may be located in different parts of the world. So how do you communicate to them? How do you communicate to them when you're remote? Even if I was operating in India and the team is in, say, Sydney, how do I ensure that they get the right information at the right time? Another interesting part is that, how do you build empathy for the entire team when the team is made up of people who may or may not have had any experience with say, Mumbai or say Nairobi? How do you instill that sense of who you're building for, who you're designing for? That's a challenge, and we've tried out different solutions. For example, entire teams go on research trips, and there are activities designed around that. It's very easy to go to, say, Lagos and stay in a 5-star hotel and in an air-conditioned taxi and not learn anything about the broader context and the people. You could meet a few people. So then how do you balance, people don't have infinite amount of time. They don't have months and months to go and learn. A lot of people have families, they have other commitments, so it's hard to come to the field. So when they come, how do you balance that with learning as much as possible and learning representatively so that you're not just learning about rich people or you're not just learning about a certain demographic? And then I think most importantly for research and for design at a place like Google, it's very important to be applied. So we're not just doing research for the sake of research. Our findings feed into broader designs and broader technologies or policy, and that is simply like, otherwise I wouldn't even be at Google, right? If there was no application of the work towards impacting something. So that's also something that you're thinking about in terms of how you answering the bigger question, with building that technology. I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
The second question was, how do you measure qualitative metrics such as privacy, let's say?
How do you measure qualitatively? I think so. So qualitative research is really good to understand why something is happening, rather than how many. For the how many, you would use quantitative research. So, for example, in the gender project that I was talking to you about, qualitative research was extremely useful to begin with in order to even understand the problem space. What are the concerns? What are the themes that affect women and technology? And once we had an understanding of this is even the right scope of the problem, this is the right problem space that these are the right questions. It's very easy to ask the wrong questions. And then it's only over time you learn what's a good question to ask. And so, yeah, qualitative research is very useful in understanding the causation and attitudes and behaviors around a certain topic. And once you have that, you could apply quantitative. You could also go on directly and apply quantitative research, right? Like you could do a large scale survey, you could do some logs analysis. That will tell you something about how many people are doing something. You can explore around it. You can have inferential statistics around very large scale data. But I do think that some of the best research happens when it's multi-method, when you have an understanding of not of why something is happening, but also an understanding of how many people are affected by it. How representative is it? Where does it break down? Can you say with confidence that this applies, to different parts of the country or to other kind of demographics? So yeah, qualitative is good for defining a metric, but I don't think you can actually measure the incidence of the metric without bigger numbers.
Yeah.
Hi Nithya, this is Pankaj. I had a question. So when it comes to emergent users, they apparently tend to have a disposable notion of digital identity. In the sense, the Google account or the Gmail account doesn't bother them so much. So how does Google deal with when there's such a large number of emergent users, and for the rest of the emerged users, identity is more significant, and that's how Google is centered around. But when identity is not relevant anymore, how does Google deal with it?
Yeah, very good question. As you rightly say, a lot of people buy phones, and then the shopkeeper may set up an account, and they don't even remember the password or what is an email address. When most people are on social media, it's meaningless for the most part, right? But then, of course, given the trajectory of technology, it's all been built around emails and certain assumptions that are made because of Silicon Valley and so on, and the people that adopted technology. So of late, there's been a big discourse around how do you enable people to create meaningful identities that they can actually remember, and not just remember the password, but that something that they can use to manage their preferences, their privacy, their visibility, terminate their account, and so on and so forth. So it's very important that the account be memorable. There have been a lot of new initiatives around using mobile phones, mobile numbers as accounts, right? And so you can link you can download an app and register using a mobile number, which I'm sure all of you have seen. But increasingly, you're seeing that for more and more experiences, and also for platform level experiences. So, for example, let's say Facebook. Facebook has WhatsApp, it has Facebook, and it has Instagram. Often what we see is that people have multiple models of privacy and identity around these. So my privacy on Facebook is distinct from my privacy and identity on WhatsApp. So you would even hear responses like, WhatsApp is just a lot safer than Facebook, even though it's of course made by the same company. And they're probably linking user data, right? So how you manifest the experiences is also important. But I agree, it's a problem that most people don't even know that they have accounts, and or what. I mean, why would you? It's meaningless. But when it comes to important actions, like somebody has hacked into your account, somebody has taken your data and done something bad with it. It is important to know that there is an account model, and we are starting to see some solutions like the mobile number one and so on. But it's important for users to regularly realize, even when you have a mobile number, it solves the problem of setting up an account, and you can remember your mobile number, of course, but then there is still the challenge of how do you go and how do you know you have control over your account? It's so invisible. Yeah, I think it's an open question.
Nithya, one more question.
Yes.
The emergent users, voice is a primary means of communication. Or for the emerged user, voice has been substituted with textual information or texting, and thereby leading to an information asset. But when it comes to emerged users, is Google looking at the model of onboarding emergent users onto the data side of things? And what are the challenges Google is facing? Because the users are primarily still voice based.
Yeah. So I think a lot of our data shows that voice interfaces have had increased usage over the past few years, because also the voice models have improved, right? There are fewer errors. It's not perfect. There are fewer errors than before, and it's also made a lot more easy to use. Like you just press the button and you can speak, and then you get responses back and so on. But then I think in our research, we actually don't see a lot of people that are primarily voice users. They may have been voice users in the sense of they are used to phone calls and prefer talking. But then in the digital medium, we really don't see a lot of voice user interface usage as much as struggling with English UIs. So the really interesting part is for the new emerging technology users. There have been several initiatives that have tried to provide multiple languages, right? So say Marathi, Hindi, Telugu, and so on. But then people, there's a lot of data that shows that people don't use multiple people don't use local languages as much as you would expect them to, even though their English language literacy may be low and or fluency may be low, or they don't even know English, but still there's a higher number of people that continue to use English language UIs, and that's I don't think that's a problem per se, because what we see is that English is an aspirational language. So sometimes even in our research, right, like when we've had multiple languages, people choose when we're doing the research, choose the English language UI because they just want to get better at English. They want to be seen using English. So it's interesting other social purposes that it serves. And then there's another problem of many UIs just don't even inform you that there are other languages. It could be hidden in like phone settings, which most people don't even go to, right? Beyond just data and battery and so on. I think for the people that are primarily voice, or rather used to speaking, that transition to reading and writing, we just need a better understanding of how to simplify English, right? So a lot of English, there tends to be multiple paragraphs of text, and like people just don't read all that stuff. Or like onboarding, right? It's like you see 3 screens and then you don't know how to get it back. People just skip through it and they don't really read it or pay attention to it. We also need a better understanding of multilingualism. So how different people have a language for reading, a language for writing, and then many languages are just very hard to input. So many people just transliterate, right, with English. How do you switch across these? And if you're not comfortable with any of these languages, when you're speaking something else, uh, that's a challenge. We're seeing some improved success with using more visuals, but it's really hard to do that for all the affordances, right? There are definitely certain aspects where you need text. We're seeing increased success with bilingual. So if you open Google Maps on your desktop, you would see that, like if you open the map of India, you would see two languages, English and the regional language of that state. So that's also working better. Yeah, I'll just say there's no silver bullet here. Like, we're not seeing a consistent voice user interface, or a person that only uses their phone using voice. We're just seeing a lot of language, textual and writing and so on. So that definitely also needs to be simplified more.
Okay. Any last questions? Yeah.
Ma'am, in your article, which is about gender equity from the Interactions magazine, in that you mentioned that in Bangladesh we met women who told us their husbands install location tracking and spyware tools on their phones to monitor their activity. So, how far is this thing true? And there is also another question. In the very same article, you stated that limited time affects how women view and access technology. But when we look at the same thing in the urban context, we find a lot of people like overusing their smartphones and spending a lot more time on these devices. So, how can a designer look at such a behavior and really, which are exactly on the opposite side of a spectrum?
Okay. First question was on Bangladesh.
So, was this like really true, or is just like something that males tell to the females to have a control over them?
Oh, I see. So you mean perception versus whether it's actually true? It's not clear. So the women that came to the study were, their husbands were overseas, and of course, as you may know, a lot of Bangladeshis work overseas, right, as migrant laborers. And they told us that their husbands had installed tracking applications that would just monitor all their calls, and so they would use their employer's phone, the lady that they were working for, to make phone calls. Now, I think it's actually irrelevant whether it's true or not. The important point is that they have a perception that they're being monitored, and
Yes.
so how do you understand that tension of you have your own phone, but you're being told that you're monitored, and you can't always use someone else's phone the whole time, and then why do you have your own phone? um, so yeah, I think it's the perception is much stronger than reality. It's not clear whether it's actually true. It may not even be true, but the fact is that it is mentioned to the women.
Yeah.
And for your second question, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. The second question.
Yeah, so amount of time that women have. I mean, that comes from a multi-country survey with nearly 30 countries, and in that survey, Indian women spend 5 hours every day on housework. Indian men spend 20 minutes every day on housework. I think you could argue, but I don't think the argument will go very far. It's completely disproportionate, and in fact, in that survey, the Indian women spent the most amount of time on housework. Indian men spent the least amount of time on housework out of the entire sample of 30 countries. So, and then if you look at comparable numbers in, say, a country like the US, it's still not the same, but I think it's something like women spend 2 hours on housework, men spend 1.5 hours on housework. So it's also a factor of, it's multiple things, right? One, do you generally have gender parity, right? Do women get any support in doing housework? Like childcare is seen as a woman's job, or interestingly, we saw this even among like professors and researchers and well-educated and upper-class women, that they would still have to dedicate time to teaching their kids, or even if you have a maid or cook, you still have to manage them. And so there's very clear gender divisions of this is my role, this is your role. Um, and part of it, of course, like the number is so small in the US, I think also because of automation of like, you have dishwashers and things like that. You don't have, there's technologies that are convenience technologies. Yeah, I'm not, like you probably see people just being addicted to phones around you, but the reality is, and of course, it probably depends on which age group. College students have a different relationship with technology than, say, married women. But on average, this is what the survey shows. And in our research, we saw, like women, regardless of whether it was a housewife or a working woman, they would often say they only have half an hour of free time. That's when no one is at home, right? And what, as a designer, so this was your question. How do you deal with this as a designer, right? These sort of facts and statistics.
Yes,
Um, it's interesting to think about if you only have half an hour of free time, how do you design an experience for that, right? So often, like if I look at my phone and I have like 5 different social media applications, my phone is just flooded with notifications, right? And by the time I just go through at least the most important ones, it's half an hour. So it's interesting to think from as a designer, how do you enable in a short amount of time, how do you separate noise from signal? How do you help people get to what they really want instead of wasting time, right? Trying to find what's meaningful for them. If I really like songs and a certain type of songs, then I should be able to find that, right? In when I have my me time rather than, spam messages from a cell phone company and whatnot. So it's interesting to think of it like that, at least to me.
Yeah.
thanks.
So thanks, Nithya. If I had half an hour right now, I would like to go and take a nap. Uh, but so thank you very much. That was a very nice talk and nice to hear about your different kinds of experiences in this field and how it is going, particularly with respect to Google and uh, with your multiple perspectives coming from India and living in the US and doing your wonderful work in different countries. It was really nice to hear all of that. Thank you very much for taking out the time today. It was really a pleasure.
It was wonderful to talk to you all. The questions were really great. It really I didn't have any easy answers for it. So thank you for asking those questions. I just want to share that we have a Google office in India. So if you're looking for internships, if you're looking for any sort of mentorship or visits, then yeah, please get in touch, and I'm happy to connect or help in any way. And I'll also send out our gender report in a couple of months when it's public. It will be great to get your reactions and see what you think at that point. Because our whole focus is around design recommendations for tackling an issue like that.
Yeah, look forward to your report. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks a
you
lot.
so much. Have a good day.